Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about a bit of a nerdy quirk that I have. Another one. I have a long list of them. But for today's video, I'm going to talk specifically about this little nerdy quirk I have about video games. I don't think I might have mentioned this before, but I think it's such an interesting thing that I've learned that other people are kind of the opposite in this. So I've learned that some people don't like using the main protagonist of a video game. So like, let's use a JRPG, for example, where you have a party of characters. Let's use Final Fantasy, for example. So let's use Final Fantasy 12, for example, because as an example I've seen, like, you can make the argument the first character you play in that game is, well, technically it's Vaughn's brother Rex and Bosch, but still, well, it's more so Vaughn because I don't think you have control of Bosch at the time. Regardless, the fact of the matter is, the main protagonist kind of seen in that is Vaughn. I mean, I've heard stuff here and there saying that Balthier is technically supposed to be that character, but regardless, that's once again neither here nor there. But the fact of the matter is, I know that there's someone who played Final Fantasy 12, like the moment they got other party members, they're like, and Vaughn, I will never use you again, just because they don't like him as a character, but also it's just also they don't like being, it's kind of like the waifu situation where it's like people don't want to get together, they don't want their waifu to be the character that you're pushing someone towards. So for example, Final Fantasy X, like Yuna's kind of like the de facto waifu. Arguably throughout the game you can get close to other characters. To me, I'm always the person that's like, oh, whatever character the game is kind of pushing towards, that's kind of my number one waifu. This doesn't just apply to video games, it applies to like manga and anime as well. That's typically my number one waifu, is kind of like whoever the character, the game is, the series is pushing for. Like for example, in Rosario plus Vampire, it was Mocha. You know, because I always like Sukune and Mocha being together. That was always a complicated thing because of the inner hour Mocha. I've had this conversation before in the video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but regardless, the fact of the matter is some people don't like the person that's kind of being pushed on you, so some people apply that to also main characters. So it's like, I don't like being forced to be locked in to play this particular character. It happens in certain games. I know Infinite Undiscovery, you can have other people in your party, but obviously you will always control Capel. Obviously, if you've never played the video game, that won't mean anything to you. Capel's the main protagonist. You literally can't play any other character. You can like use abilities from the other characters, but you can never directly control them in the sense of running around and playing with them. You always control Capel throughout the entire game. There are certain JRPGs will make it so that you have to control, like you will always have to be using the main protagonist in some shape or form, and some people don't like being locked into that. I think that some of the Persona games are like that. I could be mistaken, but I mean, it's an interesting and complicated thing because usually your main protagonist is a character you've always had throughout the entire game. Yes, you'll get other characters eventually, but usually they're the ones that's kind of with you the entire adventure. So they end up being either the most well-balanced, or at the very least, they typically end up being your strongest character, depending if you use them or not. But like I said, it's an interesting thing because I know some people don't like using the main character. They like being able to have the option to be like, oh, I could actually go through this entire game never using the main protagonist, you know? So that's always kind of a thing for people. I've never liked that. I'm one of those people like, oh, the main protagonist is always going to be in my party unless the game says otherwise. Because let me use a recent example because I've talked about these games recently. It's the Trails of Cold Steel series, which are part of the larger Legend of Heroes series. Well, in the Trails of Cold Steel series, at the very least 1, 2, and 3, because they're the only ones out here in the US yet, because we still have like 2 more months before 4 comes out here, which I'm super pumped for. But regardless, those, like the main protagonist that you stick with from the entire game is Reen. Well, the fact of the matter is with Reen, he will always be in your party, but you don't always have to fight with them. That's another thing too, because in some of those JRPGs, you are literally locked in where your main protagonist has to be on the forefront. They have to fight. You know, but you know, some games allow you to switch out them so you never have to use them actually in battle. Reen is one of those occasions where, like, if you have a full enough party, because at any time, I mean, depending on where you are in the story, you can have anywhere between 4 to 6 members, even 7 members in your party under certain circumstances. So you can make it so you wouldn't have to actually ever use Reen in your party. He'll always be technically part of your party. He will just never be in actual battle. But it's actually interesting when using Trails, for example, because there are actually moments where Reen isn't a part of your party. In a sense, there are moments in the game where they force you to, one, not use him in battle. There's at least 1 or 2 instances there's definitely like 2 instances in 1 where he's in your party, but he's kind of put in reserve. You can't put him on the front lines. There's even at least one occasion where you actually fight Rain. It's the whole lore and fee situation. Then there's I'm trying to remember, is there one in, yeah, there's technically 1 and 2. It's kind of spoilers, so I won't talk too much about it. But there was like a moment in 2 where you actually have to fight, playing different characters, fighting Rain. It's kind of spoilers, but I think there's kind of a thing like that in 4 as well, just because I know that, just because there's a gameplay trailer thing connected to it. But aside from that, there's also an instance in 4 where Rain's not even a part of your party, because it's something that the new Class 7 has to do in 3, you know, so they have to do it without Rain. So it's just one of those instances. So like, it's just interesting how Trails kind of handles that a little bit, where it's like, oh, especially if he is one of your main fighters, it is a little weird being them not having one of your heavy hitters, you know, in your party. But regardless, I just think the whole thing's kind of an interesting, like I said, conversation, because it also revolves around the fact is like I've used the example of someone not wanting to use Vaughn. It's like, I don't care if he's under leveled, which obviously that's always a detriment, because the last thing you want is a character that's under leveled, because just in case every one of your party members died, you're going to need to bring in someone and they'll be super weak. That's a whole conversation that's come up about Riku in Final Fantasy X. I've heard from some people, and like, you know, like I'd use an example of Vaughn. I'm one of those people, and I might have talked about this particular, I think I might even reference this specifically in Final Fantasy X. I'm one of those people that likes to use every character. I don't like, I want every character to kind of be roughly around the same level. So I'm always kind of like, I want to use characters, whether I really 100% use them in battle, or more so just keep them in reserve. Like using 10, for example. In that game, like, your characters always get experience, even if they go into the battle and they just guard. As long as they do something for their turn and then come out, they will always get experience for the battle. So yes, it's a lengthy process, but it's something I did throughout the entirety of my my play of the remaster of Final Fantasy X a little while back. You know, so it's one of those situations. That is something I definitely try to keep, you know, bringing it back to Trails, because I'm obsessed. I always try to use every party member, like always trying to keep them all evenly level, whether they're in reserve or not. But even not just keeping them in reserve, I do try to actually use every character. Same thing in 10. Like, I do try to make sure to make some use of every character, not just make it so that, oh, they're just leveling up and I'm never using them. I want to use every character. Obviously, that gets a little interesting in Trails, because you have like a large roster of characters. I mean, also depends on which game, at what point in the game you are amongst, you know, the 3 I've played, because sometimes you'll have your full roster, which is, you know, 9 other characters, and in other occasions there's at least another character, you know, depending, you know, the Sarah situation, but also guest characters, whether it be, spoilers, Sharon, Toval, or, you know, Claire, as well as other characters. You know, it, like I said, it all depends on the story, where you are in the story, and in which game you're playing. But it's one of those instances. So I always try to use every character. Trails ends up being in a very interesting position. This doesn't apply to all the games. Sometimes the games are a little unique in this regard, but at least 1 and 2 definitely play into this. Because obviously there's points in the game where you won't have, like, you can't have access to the full party. You can only have a certain number of characters with you when you go off and do things. Obviously later, like in 2, you have more of an option to switch characters in and out, so you can make it a little easier to evenly level characters out. 1, you don't have that option, because you're like stuck with set characters for certain chapters. So, but basically in 1 and 2, they make it so that your characters automatically level. Depending on where you are in the storyline, there'll always be a certain level. That's kind of how things work. No matter how strong you'll get, the characters will always be this certain amount of points level-wise, depending on where you are in the story. It's one of those things. So you never have to worry about it too much in 1 and 2. It's been a little while. It comes up a little bit in 3 where you do have to worry about that. So, but I think more often than not, you don't have to on some occasions, but other occasions you do. It's a whole thing. So obviously, this is me being very long-winded about it. But like I said, it's just, to me, I thought this was such an interesting conversation, because it just, obviously, like, everyone plays video games very differently. Everyone has their particular play style, how they want to go about it and stuff like that. So ultimately, that leads me to my question. I'd like to actually get to know how you are when it comes to video games like that. When you have like a party system, like, are you one of those people that's like, oh, I refuse to, I don't want to be using the main protagonist, either because you just don't straight up like them in certain cases, or is it just because you're like, I don't like being tied down, like I'm forced to use them in some games? Like, I wonder, is, you know, so is it kind of you being a little rebellious in that regard? Or are you kind of like me, where it's like you're 100% fine using the main protagonist all the time? What about the rest of the party? Do you always try to use every character like me? Or are you like, no, I have my favorites and I stick to them? I have my particular favorites. I like what my main party is, but even then, because I always switch my characters out, it gets a little muddled what my main party is in most video games I play. But regardless, like I said, I just want to know all your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good